Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and joining us again is Professor Doug Cantrell, and he's going to talk to us about immigrants in Eastern Kentucky.
Now, women generally didn't work other than in the boarding boss system. There just were not opportunities for immigrant women in coal mines. Now, in American cities, there were. Most immigrant women worked in American cities in factories. But in Eastern Kentucky, those opportunities didn't exist. Yeah. So you didn't, if you were a woman, immigrant woman, you didn't work in Eastern Kentucky other than you would work probably for your husband, or if he was a boarding boss, you would work and most immigrants who had families were boarding bosses. You would work for him. And I've interviewed some immigrant women who said that they worked extremely hard in a boarding house. One woman I interviewed was named Bessie Funick. She was a Yugoslavian immigrant. She was married to a coal miner named Tony Funick and lived in Cumberland, Kentucky, a little community, Cumberland, Kentucky. She's in Harlan County. And she talked about working from before daylight to after dark. And she worked in a boarding house in Virginia, and then she worked in one in Eastern Kentucky. And she said, she didn't get to do anything. She said she never got to go anywhere. She would, clean house, cook, do laundry, make beds, pack miners' lunch buckets, that sort of thing. And she said it took literally all day long to take care of those miners that lived in that boarding house that she worked in. And then another woman, and Tabian, I guess how you pronounce the name. She and her husband both worked in boarding houses. They married, and that's sort of what we were attracted. Both of them are children of boarding bosses, and one of them was Russian and one of them was Polish. I don't remember which was which now. But, one worked in a Russian boarding house, one in a Polish boarding house. They met, fell in love, and got married. And, were married for many, many decades. But they talked about working in a boarding house because they had somewhat better memories of it than Bessie Funick did. But they still said they worked extremely hard in these boarding houses. And that was where most women and immigrant children worked.
I don't think it sounds. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, education was difficult. You have schools, classrooms, elementary classrooms, high school classrooms, which you might have 20 languages or more spoken.
Wow.
And I don't see how teachers, especially the elementary field, dealt with it. That many languages in one classroom. But most teachers I talked with from that time period said that immigrant parents really valued education, saw education as a way for their children to achieve the American dream. That they didn't want their children to have to be manual laborers or work in the coal mines. They wanted their children to make something of themselves. And so they really stressed education and wanted these immigrant children to get A's and B's. They didn't want C's, D's, or E grade or F grades. They wanted their children to really go to school and make sure they did and make sure they attended it, that sort of thing. And so, but education would have been difficult if you were a school teacher.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Multiple languages would be tough to handle, especially with the young children. 20 different languages. That would be a lot. But I mean,
'Cause it's easier
just
probably for a child to pick up a language, English language at that
hmm
age than you it is an adult. But
hmm
so I assume they learn pretty quickly English, but it was
yeah,
difficult.
oh yeah,
Different ethnic groups. You have the Hungarians and Italians were the two dominant ethnic groups.
hmm
In most coal camps, they would vie with each other for being number one in terms of population. Either
hmm
Italians would be on top or the Hungarians would be in terms of numbers. And it varied from town to town. Harlan County probably had the most immigrants in eastern Kentucky. Uh, but you have immigrants in Hazard, the Hazard area. You have
hmm
immigrants in around Pikeville, Elkhorn City, Wheelwright. Most eastern Kentucky counties that produce coal had some level of immigration. More probably in Harlan, in Perry County, in Pike County, in Martin County, uh, along the probably Virginia, Kentucky border than anywhere else. But every county that mined coal had a few immigrants practically, and every little coal camp had some immigrants.
yeah,
And the towns were to some degree, uh, you know, similar to what was American cities on a smaller scale.
yeah,
A lot of people think that uh, Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky was isolated, that it was, a homogenous white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. That's just not true.
hmm
You have same kind of forces working in Appalachia, the Eastern Kentucky, that are working in American cities in terms of immigration. You have many languages spoken. You have the Catholic Church. You have other immigrant churches, the Eastern Orthodox, the Jewish Church. Same thing you have going on in American cities are going on in Eastern Kentucky. So it was not isolated and made up of homogenous white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. There were other people there, and that's a story that we've overlooked
hmm
throughout our history. And we've you know come to the wrong conclusion. We think Eastern Kentucky was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It was not.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very true, and very unique too for the state and the area. I mean, um, it's
Yeah,
just
we were just like we
interesting.
were like every other part of the country
hmm
that
hmm
had immigrants coming in the same time period, same people. We might have had fewer immigrants because our population was lower.
hmm
We had maybe at most maybe 5 to 6,000 immigrants at any one time in Eastern Kentucky and it's hard to determine the exact number. We can look at census data and Department of Mine reports and get figures, and they usually differ. It's the same year,
hmm
but you know, immigrants move from community to community, and often census takers didn't get them, but at least 5 to 6,000 can be documented in Kentucky about 1920, which was probably the
hmm
high point of the
Yeah,
immigrant population.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting stuff. Anything else right off the top of your head that we haven't
Not
covered?
that I can think of. I think we've covered pretty much everything. Well, we haven't talked about the fraternal organizations.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The most coal companies uh, had fraternal organizations that were created by immigrants. And I'm real familiar with Harlan County because I wrote an article on Harlan County many years ago. And in Harlan County, you have the Catholic Ladies Society, which made up mostly of immigrants who were Catholic, Catholic wives of immigrant coal miners, mainly. That organization, they did a lot of charity work. They raised money for all kinds of charitable purposes. You have also Italian clubs, and the immigrants call these organizations clubs. Italian clubs, Hungarian clubs, Yugoslavian clubs, Czechoslovakian clubs, Romanian clubs. About every ethnic group had
hmm
their own club, and these fraternal organizations, while they provided some recreational opportunity, also existed to provide mutual benefits, and historians call them mutual beneficial societies, and many of them developed into insurance companies in modern times, like Mutual of Omaha, for example.
Uh-huh.
The insurance company was started by immigrants,
Mm.
but these immigrants would, if you were, say, Italian, you belonged to the Italian club, you would pay usually a monthly fee of maybe $1 or $1.50. It would vary from decade to decade. But you would pay that fee, and initially those clubs were created to help immigrants who were the victims of mining accidents, or if the breadwinner in the family, the husband who worked in the mines, died. The wife and children would get an insurance payment or get a payment to tide them over until they could find some way to live, or usually probably move out. Because if your husband died, if you were a woman, you had to move out of the company house pretty quickly. And so it would help you find a place to live, or go back to relatives in the old country, or go back. These fraternal organizations would give money to take care of people who were in need. Mm-hmm. And they would supplement, they would actually take the dues and they would invest in the stock market, and they would make money and to keep dues low. Mm-hmm. And if your husband was killed, you'd receive a payment, or if you were injured and you couldn't work for 6 weeks or 2 or 3 months, you would receive payments to keep you going until you could go back to work. And these immigrant clubs would often sponsor social activities. One of the famous things that many immigrants I interviewed in an oral history project I did for the University of Kentucky back in the 1980s at the M.I. King Library, would talk about the Hungarian grape dance. And this was these immigrant clubs would use this to raise money for charity, and the Hungarian grape, or some people call it the Hungarian fruit dance. But what would happen is some club would sponsor a dance, and they would hang pods of grapes or other fruit from the ceiling of the dance floor, and the female dancing partner would try to convince her male partner to steal, quote unquote, a piece of the hanging fruit for her. And there would be marshals, they would call marshals, stationed around the room. And if they saw an immigrant steal, American workers came to these dances too. Some of them talked about them too. Somebody would steal a piece of the fruit, then the marshal would see them and arrest them and take them to a corner of the room and fine them according to the ability to pay. A coal mine operator might be fined $5. An immigrant worker might be fined 50 cents. But that was a way that these clubs raised money for charity, or they would sponsor cultural events, like the first opera that probably came to Eastern Kentucky through the Italian clubs and Yugoslavian clubs. I ran across some newspaper articles that talked about opera singers that were from overseas. That one was Italian at the Cincinnati Grand Opera, and the only appearance he made in Kentucky was in Harlan County in Lynch, Kentucky.
Wow!
When he was part of the Cincinnati Opera, but they would do things like that, recreational activities. But they raise money for charity, and they would build churches, or use this money to build churches, or help the poor, or again provide insurance, our form of insurance for workers who were hurt or sick, or that sort of thing. There were many of these ethnic clubs in Eastern Kentucky. Now, most of them have disappeared. There's no records left of them. You run across one occasionally, but
very impactful.
Yeah, they were, and I said some of them became insurance. Well, not in Eastern Kentucky clubs, but the clubs in northern cities became insurance companies. That's, in a way, to some degree, the beginning of the modern insurance industry was these ethnic clubs.
Yeah.
And another thing they wanted to do was to make sure that when an immigrant member died, they had a funeral in accordance with old world traditions, because funeral traditions in the United States were different from, say, in Italy or Hungary. And so these clubs would want to ensure that the funeral was conducted the way it would be conducted in the old country. And if you were a member of a club, you were required to attend any member's funeral. If you didn't attend the funeral, you were fined. And that was another
Oh,
way of
wow.
raising money.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. But,
So you
but
had to
still
go,
that.
but they wanted to make
Yeah.
sure the funerals were attended too.
Yeah.
People were there
Yeah.
because it was a status symbol. More people at your funeral, it's kind of a status symbol, and they wanted to make sure that people were there, so they would fine them if they
Hmm.
didn't show up.
Yeah. Which, I
So
mean, it still goes to show you. I mean, ties into Eastern Kentucky and Kentucky in general, supporting your community, being involved, and helping each other out. I can see how.
baseball
Yeah.
was another thing
Yeah.
we didn't talk about. Some of these immigrants would play on baseball teams,
Hmm.
and you have some people from Eastern Kentucky who actually made it to the major leagues from a
Oh,
couple of these
wow.
immigrant teams. Uh, uh, a guy named, I think it was Italian, named Nobi Balou, Ballou, was from Harlan County, who made it to the major leagues. He played
Wow.
on a coal company team in Harlan, one of the Harlan County coal camps. And there were several that from Eastern Kentucky who made it to the major leagues eventually, who got their start baseball playing on coal company teams. But almost every coal company would have a team, a baseball team,
Hmm.
and they would travel. They would form leagues. There were coal company leagues that these teams would play in. And if you were a good ball player, that's what they would hire you for. They'd give you. You had to be a worker for the company, but they would hire you, and you didn't do much work. As I interviewed, I mentioned Tony Funick before. He was a Yugoslavian immigrant and lived in Cumberland, Kentucky. And I interviewed him. He was in charge of a work crew of Yugoslavian immigrants. And he didn't like the fact that these companies would hire baseball players and put them on his work crew to play baseball because they didn't do much work. And he said they didn't do much work, but said, they play, and he spoke in broken. He said they play ball pretty hard. But he said, he always resented that, that these people would sit in the mine all day and lean up against the side of the tunnel or something and not do much. They just be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he talked about that. But and then another thing we didn't talk about were work crews, how they communicated.
Hmm.
Because you would have, and one way that immigrants would advance in the coal mining industry in Eastern Kentucky and other Appalachian states was to become work crew foremen. If
Hmm.
you learned English well enough, you would be put in charge of a crew of Italian workers or Hungarian workers or Russian or Polish or whoever. And because you could speak English and get instructions, work duties from your supervisors, the coal mine owners or the American bosses, and you could relay that then to the immigrant workers in their language. And so immigrants would advance by being named work crew foreman. And Tony Funick was a work crew foreman who talked about that. Then you would have often language work instructions posted in the lamp house or the bathhouse in multiple languages. You might have Italian, Russian, as well as English. So communication was an issue, but they overcome that
Yeah.
with these work crew foremen who would Italians would be overseen by an Italian, Russians be overseen by a
Hmm.
Russian, and then that was the way that immigrants advanced in the mining industry.
Yeah. Wow. It's just so interesting how you don't think about this, but right in the back door of Eastern Kentucky, all this is going on, and
Oh yeah.
uh, very interesting. Mhm.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
That was a
That's a
big
big
issue
thing.
among some immigrants too in Kentucky, and well, all the Appalachian states. A lot of miners wanted to celebrate holidays that we didn't celebrate in the United States,
Hmm.
and they would, since they were Catholic, they would call these big saint days. They would
Uh,
celebrate the birthday of a saint or so in the Catholic Church, and often these immigrants would consume too much alcohol, and they'd have hangovers. They wouldn't show up for work the next day.
uh-huh.
coal mine companies would have problems sometimes getting workers to show up because they'd celebrate the big Saints Day, and they would often go and get a tub of beer or something, and they would go to somebody's house, have a whole tub of beer, and a bunch of immigrants sit around and drink and get drunk and sleep it off, and they wouldn't get up to go to work. Well, the coal mine operators combated that by hiring what they would call shack rousters.
Okay.
A shack rouster was basically a coal mine guard who would come to an immigrant's house if he didn't show up for work, and they would knock on the door, and if the immigrant didn't answer the door, they would break the door down and go and drag the immigrant out of bed and dress him in his bank clothes. Miners called clothes they wore bank clothes, BANK.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a coal bank, I guess, where it came from. But they would dress him in his bank clothes and then drag him to the workplace, hangover and all. And immigrants hated these shack rousters. As Bessie Funes said in her interview, she said, these shack rousters were mean men, but they would come and drag them out of the house if they didn't show up for work and make them go to work regardless, hangover or not.
Wow.
So it was a rough life. You celebrate a big Saints Day and show up for work.
Just way to take care of your hangover, I guess, is have what's shack rouster?
Do what?
Shack rouster?
Or SHACKROUSTER. Shack rouster. And that's what they call them, shack rousters. Mm-hmm. And they would just go around and with clubs. They'd have clubs. And basically said they beat them with clubs. They had to. Another thing we haven't talked about too is debt peonage. Now that happened too. A lot of immigrants were kept in coal camps against their will by mine guards and companies who would, you see, when they would recruit them, they would advance them transportation. They call this on transportation, give them a railroad ticket, basically. Mm-hmm. And when they got to the coal camp, then they had to have a place to live. So they'd rent them a house or rent them a place in a boarding house. They had to pay for these. They didn't have money to pay for them. They had to have tools. You had to supply your own tools in the mine. You had to supply your own picks, shovels, that sort of thing. You had to have working clothes. You had to have food until you got paid. You got paid once a month. Well, the coal companies would deduct the transportation. They would deduct the cost of tools. They would deduct the cost of food, the cost of lodging, and anything else you might need from your first pay. Well, that meant most immigrants didn't get any money for about 3 months. In fact, Martin Himmler, his first coal mine job, he snuck off because he realized after he got there, he wasn't going to get any money for 3 months. And he said, I just couldn't make it 3 months without money. Yeah. And well, these workers would draw on script we've talked about before to make ends meet between payday until they got the first payday. And they would run up a debt more than they earned in wages. Mm-hmm. And so you have some immigrants who would owe the company store more come end of the month when they got paid than they worked. And so the company kept their whole check. Well, the next month they would have to go in and do the same thing, get script to eat. And then
you never get out of debt.
They didn't have any pay again. And so they ran up a big debt to companies, and it was illegal for these miners to actually leave under law. And so if a miner decided, like Himmler, to leave and was caught, they would be arrested and taken to court and probably sentenced to jail, or mostly be sent back to the company to work again. And you have a number of these cases, and the Italian embassy actually investigated. They sent an investigator, Gino Speranza, to investigate debt peonage in Appalachia. And he uncovered a number of cases in which immigrants were held against their will, sometimes arrested and beaten by law enforcement people and taken back to the coal camp. But it was a somewhat of a common practice in Eastern Kentucky and elsewhere that you have immigrants being held against their will, but by law, because they owed money to the company.
Wow.
Because of these deductions that were held. Companies would say, "Well, it's free transportation." It wasn't free transportation. The immigrant thought it was, but it wasn't, and you had to pay that, and you didn't make enough money to pay it for a long time. And if you weren't frugal, then you would
Never.
owe literally your soul to the company store, and you wouldn't be able to leave. Now,
Yeah.
many immigrants just simply snuck away.
Yeah.
They would leave, and if they were successful, like Himmler escaped after working several days, and he went north to Columbus, Ohio, I think, into Ohio, and found work there. He and some other people that he worked with from Hungary escaped, but some of them didn't get away. Most of them did probably, but some of them didn't. But some of
Yeah.
them stayed there for years and years and years because they owed money and were afraid to leave because they didn't want to go to jail.
Yeah. Wow. That is a little depressing for sure.
It's and I had one immigrant interviewed me. I interviewed in Harlan. He wouldn't talk. He wouldn't tell me. He was afraid to tell me. But he said he saw dead immigrant bodies being loaded on a railroad car,
Oh, wow.
probably during the strikes in the 1930s.
Mhm.
Where he said mine guards had killed a group of immigrants. Now, where that's true, I don't know. He would not. He was afraid to put it on tape.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but he told me about it, but he wouldn't let me record it because he was
Mhm.
still
Yeah.
afraid.
Yeah.
He said
Wow.
so. There was some violence went on. There was some criminal activity. We haven't talked about the criminal activity either.
Mhm.
There was some sort of what they would call mafia activity went on among all that wasn't a national thing. It was a local thing. There were some immigrants would extort other immigrants out of money.
Mm.
They would threaten them, uh, and you have some court cases in which there was some violence. Some people were killed. Immigrants kill immigrants because they would, if an immigrant was able to save a little bit of money, here's somebody you have some immigrant criminals who would become aware of that, and they would hold the person up and take his money or threaten go to his house and say, look, I want $500, or I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your wife or your daughter or your son. And so
Yeah.
that went on too. In fact, there was a guy who wrote a book. It's not about Eastern Kentucky, but it's about West Virginia. And this was going on among the immigrant community. Harold B. Lee, called Bloodland in Appalachia. He talks about
Mhm.
extortion, immigrants extorting immigrants. In
Wow.
the coal came. So that happened in Eastern Kentucky too, with some extortion. So
Mhm.
you have criminal enterprises that operate by immigrants in Eastern Kentucky, just as you do in American cities. It's there.
Yeah, wow. That is well, a lot of good information. Again, the whole immigrants in Eastern Kentucky, a bit of, Kentucky history that is just kind of omitted, like you said, or just not really talked about as much, and um, very interesting and very captivating compared
Well,
to,
it's
like you
it's
said, big
admitted
cities.
because sources don't exist. It's difficult to find sources,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
historians write. You got to have sources, and I said I've been working on this for around 40 some years.
Mhm.
It's taken me that long to get enough information to put a book together,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you find something, you go a long period of time, you won't find anything else, and then most of the immigrants are dead now, so you can't talk to
Mhm.
them. I was fortunate to talk to a few of the survivors, and they were elderly by then. Most of them in their 80s when I talked to them in 1985, 86.
Mhm.
But a few were still around. I was fortunate to be able to talk to some, about
Yeah.
20 or so. But
Yeah.
sources don't exist. That's why it's forgotten.
Uh-huh. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing this with us, and
Oh,
getting
happy
this
to.
information out there. It's really, again, really captivating to think about these things happening right here in Kentucky, um, and the lasting impacts as well. I mean, it's really good, and in Himmler's life and all that stuff, it's all good Kentucky history.
Well, the immigrants who survived, who lived in Kentucky the rest of their life, they've assimilated so much
Mhm.
that other than maybe the last name, nobody ever know they were immigrants. As I said
Yeah.
once before, I interviewed immigrant, well, two immigrants in I think it was in Perry County, I believe it was around Hazard,
Mhm.
Pino and Guido Castanero, and one of them had married they were brothers. One of them had married, they were Italian brothers, and one of them had married an American woman named Betty Castanero. And I interviewed, and Betty talked as much as the men did in the interview, but she was real funny and she was real sociable. And at the end of the interview, she said, it was time, the Statue of Liberty ceremony had been on television, and she brought that up. She said, I would have forgotten that Pino and Guido, her husband and brother-in-law, were immigrants, she said, until the Statue of Liberty celebration came on TV, and that reminded me that Pino and Guido were immigrants. And that's the situation that exists now in Eastern Kentucky. They're there, but their assimilation's completed, and so you wouldn't know. So we talked about the Dahlhauer family. They were Syrian immigrants or Lebanese. The Amar brothers, who founded the Magic Mark department store chain, or the Dahlhauers, who founded the Dahlhauer chain of clothing stores, they were part of this immigration who came into Eastern Kentucky. Now, they weren't coal miners; they were pack peddlers who sold goods to coal mining immigrants, and they made good, and they became, both of those families owned chains, and they usually, Eastern Kentucky, there were Magic Mark stores, there were Dahlhauer stores in Eastern Kentucky, also in Western Virginia and in Southern West Virginia. You have all three, both companies having stores in all three of those states, and that was the immigrant legacy, I guess. Too.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very connecting to all these other things that you don't think about as much as right there in Eastern Kentucky. Mr. Cantrell, we thank you for coming on the show and talking about all this, sharing all this information.
Glad to do it.
Let us know when the book is available, and we can.
It'll be hopefully within the next couple of years. I've finished everything except the conclusion. I've got to write the conclusion and then do some editorial work on it, and then get it to a publisher.
There you go. Well, thank you again for coming on and sharing this, and thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in Western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. the viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.